Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story, a delicate balancing act for the U.S. between the Middle East and China. U.S. allies in Asia are expressing increasing concerns over the strikes on Iran. The big question, will the widening war divert U.S. resources from deterring China? A panel of guests joins us to discuss the latest in the Iran conflict and its impact on U.S.-China relations. A looming threat from China. U.S. Navy intelligence says Beijing is investing heavily in nuclear-powered submarines, trying to catch up with the United States. The U.S. walking a fine line between the Middle East and China. As Israel launches a new wave of strikes on Iran, U.S. allies in Asia are expressing increasing concerns. One nagging question, will the war in Iran divert the U.S. resources needed to deter China? A lawmaker in Taiwan is urging Washington to shift its focus back to the Indo-Pacific.
We hope that the operation in Iran will be fast and limited, and that U.S. military resources can be promptly shifted back to Asia.
The lawmaker expresses concern that the Chinese regime could intensify its harassment of Taiwan while U.S. attention is focused on the Middle East. Similar worries are emerging among Japanese lawmakers. They met on Monday to discuss the U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran. A politician who attended the meeting told Reuters that concerns were raised over how East Asia would respond to a gap in its defenses if Washington diverted military assets stationed there to the Middle East. The politician said Tokyo has sought assurances from Washington that it will not do so. Right now, about 40% of U.S. warships ready for operations are stationed around the Middle East. Carrier deployed in Asia is undergoing maintenance in Japan. Brian Clark, a former U.S. defense official, says that the U.S. Navy is stretched thin and that if the war in the Middle East drags on, the U.S. could draw down naval resources in Asia to reinforce operations against Iran. Meanwhile, the war in Iran is also depleting U.S. munitions. Analysts are currently divided over how the U.S. strikes on Iran are affecting China. Some say this action could allow the U.S. to focus on containing China after weakening two of Beijing's allies, Iran and Venezuela. Others say the longer the strikes on Iran last, the more Beijing could benefit. A Japanese lawmaker told Reuters that the grand strategy is to contain Iran in the Middle East, then shift resources toward dealing with China. But the question remains whether there will be enough resources left to shift. And in Taiwan, a high-ranking U.S. diplomat is visiting the island on Monday and Tuesday. Casey Mace represents the United States as the senior U.S. official to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, also known as APEC. APEC meetings will be held later this year in China. Beijing has refused to allow Taiwan to participate as a sovereign country, just as it has tried to block or limit Taiwan's participation in many other international conferences. The war in and around Iran has shut down tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz for a fourth straight day on Tuesday. This is sending shockwaves across global energy markets and has pushed oil prices way up. The strait accounts for about 20% of global oil and gas supply. The vast majority goes to markets in Asia, including China, Iran's only remaining oil customer. China imports more crude oil than any other country. About 30% of China's LNG imports and 40% of its oil imports are from the Middle East. Iranian state media reports a senior official saying on Monday that Iran will set fire to any ship that attempts to transit the strait. To discuss the latest in the Iran conflict and its impact on U.S.-China relations, we spoke on Monday with an expert panel of guests. Anders Kaur, he's the publisher of the journal Political Risk and principal at Core Analytics. He's also the author of The Concentration of Power. We're also joined by Rob Maness, a retired U.S. Air Force colonel and a former wing and squadron commander. And Anders, 11 countries are now involved. There's a lot of focus on the Strait of Hormuz with reported disruptions in terms of tanker traffic. What are the ripple effects of this, especially on oil heading to China?
The concern is, of course, that oil prices are going to go up. Gas prices are going up. There's a lot of volatility in the oil and gas markets right now. But I mean, bigger picture, this is a big blow to China because Iran is one of the biggest suppliers of oil, along with Russia, to China. So they're going to be scrambling for oil and gas resources in the near future.
And Colonel, your thoughts on what happens next and how likely are we to see the Iranian people overthrow their government?
Well, I'm glad that Secretary Rubio precisely stated those objectives because, Iran's mullah-driven government has been at war with America and with all of its neighbors, really, since 1979, so over 47 years now. And now we have a president and a team around him that's capable and has the courage to do what's right, and that's end this once and for all. The ballistic missile capability is their weapon of choice to harass their neighbors, to kill innocents, and they routinely target civilian population centers in order to make as big of a splash as possible by killing innocent civilians. So this is a good move. The shipping issue is very, very important. The oil to China has already been mentioned, but one of the biggest stories that's not being covered is that Lloyd's of London and the other insurers are now refusing to insure the merchant vessels going through the Straits of Hormuz, which wasn't even done in the Black Sea because of the Russia and Ukraine situation there. So something is going on with that. That is a major story, and it's also a major situation that needs to be corrected right away. I don't know if it's because of the weak intelligence that the UK gets because they've destroyed the relationship with the United States, so they can't pass good information to Lloyd's of London. But we have to rectify that situation because all the fuel, all the weapons, all of that type of material and resources goes primarily through sea-based shipping, and it's got to be fixed.
And Anders, your thoughts on that, and also what could a transition look like inside Iran?
I think that about 80% of Iranians would like to see regime change in Iran. It's the one thing that I think could really create a durable peace in the Middle East. Iran is the major promoter of terrorism through its proxies, Hamas, Houthis, and Hezbollah throughout the Middle East. They're the one that keep threatening Saudi Arabia, our other Arab allies in the Middle East. So if we can get regime change, and I know that's not the primary objective, but I think it's certainly one of the objectives, one of the side objectives of the administration, is to get a friendly government in Iran towards the U.S. and towards Israel. That would go a huge way towards moderating and mitigating the risk, not only in the Middle East, but with Russia and China, because Iran is so connected to those two countries.
And Andrew, zooming out a bit here, Iran and Venezuela have long established ties with communist China, supplying lots of sanctioned oil. What message is this Iran operation on top of the recent Venezuela operation sending to China?
Well, it's sending a huge message to China that its small-time allies, whether it's Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, Iran, are not really very stable. They can be taken out. And I think what you're seeing is with Venezuela and Iran is that there's kind of a new model of regime change where you knock out the leader or you capture the leader and take him back for prosecution in the United States. And then you wait for a new leader to come in. And if that leader is good and pro-US, you leave him alone. If he's not good, you can go in and capture that one as well. And as long as these are authoritarian leaders, obviously you can't do it to a democracy, but as long as these are authoritarian leaders, dictators and the like, you can just keep on doing that at relatively low cost, I think, until you get a pro-US government in place in Tehran. So the regime change would be different than in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, where we had troops on the boots on the ground. We had extensive time required to set up what we tried to make democratic governments, which actually just became corrupt governments. So I think there is a new model, and I think that model is, I would say, repeated removal of the leader until you get a good one, essentially.
And Colonel, do you expect this war to change the dynamic for President Trump's April trip to Beijing?
Well, I suspect that it will. We've bottled up almost 25% of China's oil between Venezuela and the Iranian operation now, and that gives the president a really big chip when he comes to the table from a position of strength to talk to President Xi. The other thing that's going on here is Xi's defensive weapon systems, integrated air defense systems, radars, and those kind of things that have been sold to Venezuela and the Iranians have utterly failed. And our forces have gone through them and eliminated them and taken down those air defense systems systematically to the point where they don't have much credibility. So that's another card that the president has to play. And I think it bodes well for any decision Xi might make to go after Taiwan using military force. They have to really think about that now. And that's the whole idea behind deterrence. And this whole operation, the Venezuela operation, China, the Communist Party of China, is really the target of this from a strategic perspective. And I think it's going to play out well for the president.
Well, Colonel Rob Maness, Anders Corr, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A looming threat from China. U.S. Navy intelligence says the Chinese regime is investing heavily in nuclear-powered submarines. NTD's David Lamb reports.
China is ramping up submarine production, shifting gears to all nuclear construction.
Through massive infrastructure investments at several of its primary shipyards, China has more than doubled its submarine construction capability, setting up for sustained submarine growth through the 2030s and beyond.
The U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission hearing testimony on Monday, discussing China's growing capabilities both on the sea and beneath it.
Drawing lessons from the war in Ukraine, Beijing is exploring how unmanned underwater systems could offset the U.S. advantages, particularly inside the first island chain. Last September, the PLA unveiled 2 new extra-large uncrewed underwater vehicles.
Rear Admiral Mike Brooks of the Office of Naval Intelligence says that China operates more than 60 submarines, 6 of which are nuclear-powered attack vessels. At least 2 are nuclear-powered guided missile subs, and another 6 are nuclear-powered ballistic missile subs.
China's ballistic missile submarines, equipped with long-range strategic nuclear missiles, can now target portions of the United States from protected waters near China.
The shift to nuclear power is a strategy that could be used to increase regional presence and patrols more economically. China has also spent more than 20 years investing in unmanned undersea vehicles. If China's military ambitions progress, Brooks estimates that its fleet will grow to 70 by 2027 and an additional 10 by 2035. Half of the fleet could be nuclear powered. David Lamb, NTD News.
Coming up, an Asian man attacks a volunteer from a faith group in broad daylight in New York City. Behind the violence is the CCP's ongoing persecution that has been targeting a spiritual practice for over 25 years. The U.S. airstrikes on Iran are sending shockwaves across global economies. How will the oil disruptions impact China? An expert weighs in. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Violence against a faith group on the streets of New York City is raising concerns. Just a couple of days ago, video shows an Asian man assaulting a woman in Flushing, New York, while she was distributing flyers to call for an end of China's persecution of her faith. Here's that clip. Watch. Security camera footage shows a man who appears to be Asian striking the woman, knocking her to the ground and running away. The woman's hat and glasses fell off during the assault. The attacker's face was recorded, and now police are investigating the incident. The woman was distributing flyers, hoping to raise awareness of the ongoing persecution in China against her faith, Falun Gong, and calling on people to quit the Chinese Communist Party and its affiliated organizations. Falun Gong practitioners have been engaging in nonviolent demonstrations against the persecution for over 25 years. The U.S. is continuing airstrikes on Iran as the death toll in the conflict rises. To discuss the war's economic impact, including its effect on China, NTD Steve Lance was joined by Brigham McCown, Senior Fellow and Director of the Initiative on American Energy Security.
We're seeing crude oil spiking, jumping by more than 5%, and that increase is likely to be felt at the pump for you and me. How big of an impact will this have on gas prices in the United States, and might we see it rise even further?
Yeah, what a great question. Thanks for having me on tonight. Right now, we've not seen the spikes of global markets that many had predicted. About every $10 increase in crude oil translates to about 25 cents a gallon at the pump. And Brent and West Texas Intermediate, which are our benchmarks, are certainly elevated based on Strait of Hormuz disruption, insurance company withdrawing their war risks, and tanker rerouting. So that risk premium is now embedded in the price, but could it go higher? Absolutely. Could we see $80, $100 per gallon? Per barrel? Possibly. It really depends on how long this goes on. But this is not 1973, and the U.S. is now largely self-sufficient.
Now, we saw the president the eve before the strikes in Corpus Christi, Texas, speaking at an oil refinery down there with a Venezuelan tanker over his shoulder with millions of gallons or thousands of gallons of oil. He was touting American energy dominance. We often hear the president saying, drill, baby, drill. This was a campaign message. Can this issue that we're seeing be resolved by ramping up domestic energy production?
Well, it's been mitigated by what we've seen already in that the United States is the largest producer of crude oil on the planet. Had that not been the case, we would have seen a very different picture already today. In essence, we've been insulated against these geopolitical threats from the Mideast. I mentioned 1973, the Arab oil embargo. We were so highly dependent on oil from the Gulf. That's simply just not the case for the United States. It's not true for everybody. But what mitigates that impact is U.S. production capacity, and if needed, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is available, and the fact that we have a diversified import profile.
Talk to us, if you could, Brigham, about the Strait of Hormuz. Many of us may not have heard it before, heard of it. How vital is this shipping lane to Iran? And do you think we're hearing Iran saying that they will shoot down or shoot at anybody, any boat, tanker that comes through there? They have yet to do that from what we understand. But how critical is that passage?
Well, traditionally, it's been a very critical passage because all of the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia to some extent, transit the Straits of Hormuz. It's a narrow piece of ocean. You can see it there on the map. I've been through it. I've sailed through it myself in a different time, and it's a choke point. About 20% of the world's oil and a large percent of natural gas also pass through that strait. In the past, Iran has threatened to close it, but what we've really seen is not Iran closing it, but Iran hassling ships, Iran harassing ships in the territory, and that risk can't be taken lightly. But, it's interesting because closing the strait does two things. It ties up Iran from being able to export any oil, and it ties up Iran's number one benefactor, China, because while the Straits of Hormuz are responsible for 20% of global supply, China is the largest beneficiary. China has the largest to lose.
And how long do you ultimately expect this disruption to potentially last? And what can the United States do to restore full operations in the Strait of Hormuz? And is it even in the U.S. interest to take on that risk at this moment, do you think?
Well, I think the likelihood of a full closure is probably low. Are we going to see intermittent disruptions that we've already seen? Yes. Are we going to see some functional impairment? I think there's a high probability of that for the next couple of weeks. But supply chains are resilient, and generally we build in 30 to 45 days of supply. So if this doesn't go on for 4 to 6 weeks, everything will rebalance pretty quickly. Iran historically used harassment, as I mentioned before. It's not a permanent shutdown. And I think Iran is going to hesitate because it depends on oil exports. Closing the Straits of Hormuz hurts Gulf states and China, and it invites an overwhelming U.S. naval response. The first couple days, we've seen the U.S. take out anti-air defenses, meaning we can have air superiority now, which has been established. That now allows us to strike at will any ground-based targets or ships, including those that would have to be used to close the straits. So with each passing day, Iran's ability to project power and to close the straits is diminishing.
as you mentioned, China relying on much of the oil that comes through that narrow gap. They also rely on sanctioned oil from Iran and Venezuela, which is sold at discounted rates to China. We've seen the arrest of Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro and now the military operations in Iran. Unpack further, if you could, how significant this supply chain disruption is for China and how long they might be able to sustain it.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're absolutely right. China has counted on discounted oil that they've bought from sanctioned states. They have not, they will give lip service to UN sanctions, to other sanctions for belligerents, but ultimately they've benefited greatly from discounted or bartered oil. What you're seeing around the globe, though, is China's having a very bad year. Its proxies are being eliminated one by one. I don't think this is by mistake, but it is a grand strategy. One of the leverage points the United States has over China is that China lacks the natural resources it needs, importing well over 70% of its oil. By removing Venezuela, that piece is now gone. By hopefully here eliminating Iran, that piece is gone. That gives the United States and its allies leverage. China has used critical minerals as leverage. Well, oil is going to become a large leverage point back at them.
Brigham McCown, greatly appreciate your insights. Thank you for joining.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For on-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.